Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
Excuse me, Mr. President, just to clarify on what you were asked earlier, is the $1.8 billion DOJ fund dead or is it on hold?
It's, I'd have to ask the lawyers, I don't know. I know one thing, the weaponization, are you talking about the weaponization fund?
Yeah, what's your decision?
The weaponization fund, as far as I'm concerned, was a beautiful thing. It was something I didn't make it, but I heard that, I thought that was the greatest thing because people like you have abused our people so badly. The fake news like CNN, like the New York Times and like others, have abused our people. Wait a minute, be quiet. Have abused our people so badly, and you should be ashamed of yourself. You used to be a conservative. She was a conservative from Alabama. Can you believe it? But CNN, in particular, CNN does such false reporting. But now they have new ownership, so maybe it'll straighten it out. I doubt it, but it's hard to straighten garbage out. But CNN has abused, and others have abused so badly. People are crooked as hell. CNN's a very corrupt organization, but with a corrupt reporter standing right there. Never smiles. She never smiles. She's a young, beautiful woman, never smiles. I never see a smile off her face. I see her standing there with hatred in her eyes, like she has hatred because we have borders, because we have a strong military, because we cut our taxes.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Highest Power Church and State. This is episode 132, and I'm Rick Pidcock, your host. And normally I do an interview or I plan out a scripted episode to give you. And today I just kind of want to deal with some of this nonsense that we're getting from the Trump administration, specifically regarding how Trump has lashed out at Caitlin Collins again, and he's telling her to be quiet, and he's talking to her about how horrible she is. And I just want to kind of talk about how I'm feeling about all this, because I think it really gets to the heart of a lot of my issues here with not only the Trump administration, but also with conservative evangelical theology and the theology that I walked away from in the conservative evangelical church. And so I'm not going to edit this up. You'll probably hear some sounds in the background of kids playing outside or other kids on their motorbikes riding by. But I just kind of wanted to talk through this because I think when it comes down to it, when I listen to Trump and I listen to the way he's talking to Caitlin Collins, I think I really just do not like mean men. And I think that's really what I feel so much every day in and out is like, I'm just sick and tired of mean men. It makes me think about the way I was treated growing up by angry, mean men. It makes me think about the way I was treated in the conservative evangelical church with men who were behaving meanly towards those who were underneath them. And I see it in Trump, and I also see it paralleled in the theology that they promote. And it just wears on you after a while. And I think if I just put it down in maybe its simplest form that I can think of right now, it's just, I don't like mean men. And there was a song when I grew up in fundamentalism. There was a music company that I used to like called Majesty Music, and they were run by a guy named Patch the Pirate, and so they put out children's programs, and it was, they had some fun tapes on there and stories and stuff, and then they put out some adult tapes as well of their Christian music, and there was this song that he had called I Saw Jesus in You, and the lyrics said, "When I enter heaven's glory and I see my Savior's face, I will offer him 10,000 years of praise. Then I'll find that special one in whose life I saw God's Son, and through tears of joy with trembling lips these words I'll say, I saw Jesus in you, I saw Jesus in you. I could hear his voice in the words you said, I saw Jesus in you." And that was one of the most popular songs in the independent Baptist world that I grew up in. And when I think back about that song now, like, it was always this idea that there were people in your life that when you looked at them, that's who you saw Jesus in. And you were like, oh, that's what God is like. That's what Jesus is like when I see that person. And over the decades, as I grew up in the church, as I went on as an adult to minister in the church, I started to realize that the idea here in the song is that you see the character of God in certain people. And so that makes a connection in your mind between what God is like and what certain people are like. And so let's say you were to see somebody who was feeding the sick, feeding the hungry, clothing the poor. And if you would say, I saw Jesus in you, then you're saying that I think the nature of God, the character of God, is that God cares about the poor, the sick, the needy, the hungry, the lowly. But if you saw somebody who was self-obsessed and who was being violent toward others, who was abusing children, if you were to say, I saw Jesus in you, in that person, then you're saying things about the nature and character of God that you believe to be true about God. And those two depictions of God are very different gods. One is the idea of a God who has a presence in and among the least of these, who cares for others, who loves self and neighbor and enemy, and who doesn't see a division between self and neighbor and enemy. And the other is a self-obsessed narcissist who lashes out in violence toward anybody who doesn't bend the knee. And when you look at the history of the world, when you look at the history of the church and politics, you see a lot of men like that. And you look at the harm that is caused in our society and in the world today, a lot of it is caused by men like that. It's not caused by the men who care for the least of these. It's caused by the men who are so obsessed with their own power, their own authority, that they become violent towards anyone who doesn't bend the knee. And those are mean men, and none of us like them. We're all harmed by them. We all have intergenerational trauma by them. And so when I come to these theological conversations, and when I look at these politics that are happening today, like, in my mind, I'm coming at from that mindset where I grew up thinking I saw Jesus in certain people. And so I have a connection between the nature and character of God and the nature and character of these followers of God. And so if I don't like mean men, I'm not going to like a God who looks like mean men. And so in this conservative evangelical world of places like the Gospel Coalition, Desiring God, Grace to You with John MacArthur that I was in, we talked about this idea of living out the gospel. There was the gospel, and then there was living out the gospel. And those two ideas were speaking the same language. So in the gospel, we had this idea that God the Father primarily was concerned about self-glory, that God the Father loved himself above all. That's why we couldn't sing the song above all. Above all, you took the fall and thought of me above all. None of the churches that I was in as an adult would allow me to lead that song in worship because, that would be idolatry. That would be putting humanity above God. And so everything existed in this hierarchy. And God thought not about humans, not about others, not about neighbor. God thought about self above all. And so everything that God would do would be about glorifying God's self, would be about showing how big and strong and how God is the highest and the most powerful. And it was all an expression not of loving humanity, not of loving God's neighbors or God's enemies, but of loving God's self above all in a hierarchy. And so that extended itself into these relationships of authority and submission, that because God primarily exists at the top of this hierarchy, God then orders everyone below in this created order of authority and submission. And so that's where you would get, men being at the top and women having to submit to men and children having to submit to men. And in previous generations, slaves having to submit to white men. And that was basically the idea. And so all of this gospel language of, what is the good news and how do you become saved, it's all about submitting to this God who is primarily obsessed with self at the top of a hierarchy that then organizes everyone below in relationships of authority and submission. And so all of the worship language then begins to celebrate this God. It was all about how I once was a slave, but now I'm adopted. I was once this lowly worm, but now I'm way up. I'm in the family. And it's all of the language in the worship songs was celebrating this gospel where you were down here on the hierarchy, you were a lowly slave, and now you're a son or a daughter. And so it's about being elevated up the hierarchy over your neighbors. And then you still have all of these dynamics of authority and submission within that. Love gets subsumed into that hierarchy to where love is now defined as getting others to submit to your hierarchy. And so when your worship language is bathed in this and your ethics is living out this gospel that God the Father punished God the Son. God the Father on the cross forsook God the Son, said, "God damn you," as R.C. Sproul used to say. It was God the Father saying, "God damn you" to God the Son. John MacArthur talked about how God punished at the cross. God was primarily angry not at the empire and not at anything, but other than God was angry at Jesus and was taking out his wrath on just violently torturing Jesus. And so when your gospel songs, your worship songs are about celebrating that, what you celebrate becomes easier to imitate. And so you've got this God who is obsessed with self-glory, who defines love as glorifying the self, and who exercises power over others to the degree that it causes a split within the Trinity, God the Father over and against God the Son. And then you've created God as this emperor who has to get his way on everything. And everything depends on absolute loyalty to this emperor. And so then you throw the Bible into this situation, and the Bible is the revelation of that highest king. Well, of course, it's got to be perfect. It's got to be inerrant. You can't have any questions about this text because it's got to be perfectly inerrant. Otherwise, you don't have a foundation to stand on. And so like this week, I got into it a little bit on Facebook with some people because I posted some things about inerrancy. Like one of the things I talked about was how there's a contradiction. There's a fundamental contradiction within the verses in the Bible that talk about genocide against your neighbors and, chopping your wife's hand off and showing her no pity, and the verses about loving your neighbor as yourself. I said, you can't, those are two fundamentally contradictory ideas. And the reason why this is so important is because the Christian nationalists of today, they draw all their inspiration from these conquest narratives in which the violence is said to be sacralized, to be commanded by God. They don't draw their inspiration from the Sermon on the Mount or from the fruit of the Spirit. They're literally interpreting the entire Bible and all of their political life through the lens of the conquest narratives. And through the lens of fighting their enemies and taking the land as plunder for themselves. And so because the Bible is inerrant, and because the Bible talks about Yahweh commanding these things, therefore they have to defend it. And they have to defend genocide. And when I was at Northern Seminary, there was this paper I had to do where I had to look at all of these different scholars on how they defended these genocide passages. And a lot of them were just so awful. They were all written by white men on the top of, the power dynamic. They weren't written by black women on the underside of power. And so that affected a lot of the ways they wrote. And one of the most difficult parts that I read was when they were talking about war rape in the Hebrew Bible, and they said there were some surprisingly positive developments around war rape that they discovered. And there was just part of my humanity in that moment that was like, if I've got to, feel good about some surprisingly positive developments around war rape, what am I even doing here? Like, this is completely incompatible with loving your neighbor yourself. And so I posted some statuses about this, and some people, men, of course, got upset. Some inerrantists did, and started accusing me of all kind, being a Marcionite and all this kind of stuff, and not having a foundation on which to stand anymore. And I simply asked him, I was like, so like, let's get specific here. Because again, you got to remember, my whole thing is like, I don't like mean men. So in this situation where a man is stabbing a woman and her baby, ripping open her womb and dashing her baby against a rock, the mean man in that conversation is the man. It's not the woman. It's not the baby. And so I basically, that's where I'm coming from here. And so I said to them, so as the man is plunging the sword into this woman and she's bleeding out, is that an act of love? And these inerrantists responded, because they couldn't admit there was a contradiction. They couldn't say it wasn't an act of love, because everything has to be perfectly consistent. They said, yes, that genocide is an act of love when it is commanded by God. So to love the woman is to stab the woman. And again, I just don't like mean men. And I'm tired of mean men harming women and children and infants. And that is what we're seeing with these people who constantly have to defend all of these narratives of these ancient Near Eastern people, tribes, committing genocide against one another. They're having to defend that as perfect, as God's will. And then they're talking about how the same God back then is the same God today. Now, I'm not denying, I don't think that if there's a God, I don't think God changed within the last 3,000 years from being for genocide to against genocide. That doesn't make any sense. In light of a 14 billion year universe, it doesn't make sense in that little tiny blip of 3,000 years that God would go from for genocide to against genocide. That doesn't make any sense. I think what makes a lot more sense to me is that as a people are wrestling with God, since that's what Israel means, that they thought God was this way. And as we see their journey unfolding throughout Scripture, we're starting to see, oh, this is, you're experiencing wounds at the hands of empire, and at times you're behaving like the emperors. And I think that that's what we're seeing in their story. And I think that really has a lot to say to us today, because we today, too, also have both impulses. We long to be liberated from those who control us and threaten us, and we also embody the empire toward others. Both are true. And so for me, it's hard for me to walk away from the biblical narrative when I see it so much as reading and explaining the human condition and helping us cultivate empathy toward others and a recognition within ourselves that we also embody the empire at times, and we project that onto God. And so I say all that, and I come to this passage in Matthew 25, because a lot of this eventually gets to the threats about hell. And, the inerrantists and the conservatives threaten me that if I don't submit to God, I'm going to go to hell. Matthew 25, you got the sheep and the goats. You're a goat. That's the accusation, And it's like, okay, well, if you look at the sheep and the goats, the goats weren't defined as those who don't submit to white evangelical theology, because that didn't even exist at the time. The goats were those who harmed the least of these. And the sheep were those who cared for the least of these. And the king in the story was one who defined his brothers and sisters as the least of these. And so in that sense, if the king is in the dirt with the least of these, like, on one sense, the whole idea of kingship it's kind of deconstructed at that point. Like, we are family, and we are one, and we care for one another. To love the self is to love. You can't love your neighbor apart from yourself, and you can't love yourself apart from your neighbor. You can't liberate yourself apart from liberating your neighbor, and you can't liberate your neighbor apart from liberating yourself. It is one thing. And to me, that resonates with how I understand reality to be. It resonates with how I understand the world to be, the universe to function. And it's actually good news. And the mean men are the ones who say, no, If you don't submit to me, you will be punished with violence done to your human body. And so I think that there's just too much here that makes sense. When I look at the politics, when I look at the theology, when I look at the church and how the different power dynamics play themselves out, on the conservative, evangelical, complementarian, Calvinist side of things that is so dominating the Southern Baptist Convention and so dominating much of American Christianity today, it's men who are obsessed with self-glory, who are obsessed with exclusive power, and who define justice as violent retribution against human bodies. And when I look at them, I cannot fathom the concept of looking at those men and saying, I saw Jesus in you. If there's an afterlife and I end up standing face to face with Jesus, I can't imagine in that moment looking to my left and seeing Donald Trump and seeing Albert Mohler and seeing John MacArthur and seeing John Piper and seeing Greg Locke and Mark Driscoll and Josh Howerton and all these men and being like, I saw Jesus in you. Like, what part of Jesus did I see in them? I saw men who were constantly exerting themselves over others. And so for me to think those men are right, I would have to basically think God is a mean man. And I don't like mean men. And I think the reason we're experiencing so much collective stress that I'm kind of feeling tonight myself as well is because we all know intuitively that mean men are not good news for society. And mean men are not the ones who most closely reflect the nature and character of a God who can be recognized as good and as good news to the least of these. Anyway, that's my rant for today. Kind of wanted to get it off my chest. I appreciate everyone listening, and if you would subscribe and like and share us with friends of yours who may be interested in listening to the podcast, I'd really appreciate it. And we'll be back with another episode on Monday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.
This episode was produced and edited by Mac Bowles of TKG Communications, LLC, Dallas, Texas.